Hello guys. I've gotten a few requests recently that I talk a little bit about my background and kind of like how I came to be how I am, and so I decided maybe I'll do a little video on that right here. So let me start off by saying I was born in 1960 in Queens, New York. And although I don't really remember much of that, I do have a vague memory of coming home and having the house broken into and ripped up again, as what I was told. And my folks, I don't know, maybe they're third generation or whatever, but they didn't want to be in New York anymore, and they loaded the two little boys. I got a little brother 3 years younger who lives in Ireland now, who I never see, and loaded them up in the car, and they took off. Now, I'm told that we lived in Florida for a while and Colorado for a while. I don't remember that, but ultimately they migrated to California, and I think a lot of people were going to California in the 60s. It was the place to be. And for some time, we lived on hippie communes, I guess you could call them. And I have some memories of these places, but these places were what I saw mostly. They were really cheap rent in communal living. One place had two houses, and they had an adult house, and the kids weren't allowed in it. And so we all lived in the kids' house, and every night different parents would come down and stay the night in the kid house. You'd get excited when your parents showed up. And when it was hot in these places, people didn't wear clothes. You didn't have to. That's why I was just used to that. So when I finally got in the motorcycle scene, they did the show me your tits thing. I was like, who cares? I grew up around that. But these were I have good memories of these places. What was interesting was I could walk up to anybody and say I was hungry, and anybody would cook for me or get me something to eat. I remember that. It didn't matter who they were. And so they were good memories of these places. I remember one guy telling me he was staying there for $20 a month. So it was really cheap living. And we lived on different ones. But later on, my folks split up, which I never held against them. They were not made for each other, And my mom moved on to one of these places in Santa Cruz, California. We were in Northern California, and she said she had moved there because there was men there, and she wanted her boys to be able to be around men. But what she did was, this was a larger piece of property with a house in the middle of it, and she put a little Airstream trailer she got on the far end of the property, and they just pushed it off, and they kind of let it go, and it landed across the top of a small creek. And the place was so small that they built a shelf over the bathtub for us boys to sleep in. It was too small for me. So I ended up with a tent for a bedroom outside. And I have fond memories of that place. There was guys there. There was a few motorcycles. I got a mini bike by then. All I ever wanted, man, I was a bicycle addict, and it went from bicycles straight to motorcycles, and I don't know why. Nobody else in my family's that way. But by then I had a mini bike there, and there was a lot of guys. We had one cat there who was a crazy inventor. I think his name was Gary. And he had built this love machine, and although I was too young to know what it was, I remember watching it run. And I think it had a pull starter or something. I don't remember. But once they got it started, this machine, it was like wheelbarrow size, only round or something, and it would begin to shake, and it had red, green, and yellow lights or something on it, and the lights would flash, and it would begin to moan. And as it kept going, it would begin to go faster and faster until it was vibrating, and all the lights were blinking, and it was moaning. And then at one point it would stop, all the lights would come on, and it would squirt foam out this. It would squirt this stuff out the top. My mom later told me that was shaving cream. Gary used shaving cream to make that happen. And we had a crazy potter, and they had a sauna room and a creek. People would take saunas and jump in the creek. And I have good memories of these places. I don't have bad memories of any of that. And what does a boy need? I think I had a tent with like a bed and an extension cord or something. What does a boy need? I was happy with that. I was fine with that. But I was kind of an incorrigible kid, and eventually Mom sent me. I went to live with my dad for 3 years. And this was in the 70s. And my father, he was a fairly large dope dealer. And although he didn't like sell heroin and all that stuff, it was like having 600 kilos of weed in the house was not uncommon. I saw the Afghanistan hash. It comes in big slabs, or it used to come in big slabs. I seen it in boxes across the room. And so I stayed there for about 3 years, but my dad's not a criminal, nor is he a drug addict or an alcoholic. It was a different time, and the stuff that he stayed involved in was just weed and that kind of thing, you know? Although at one point we did have 250,000 hits of acid in the freezer. That was part of the time, you know? But anyways, eventually, man, I left there with a buddy, and it's not that my parents were bad, because they weren't. I was just chomping at the bit to get free, and I wasn't even quite 16. And my buddy was 16. He had a driver's license, and I didn't even have a learner's permit. And we had this old Econoline van, and we took off. We went back to where he lived, 500 miles south from Santa Cruz into the mountains of Lake Arrowhead. And I fell in love with that place, and I wanted to stay there and never leave. Lake Arrowhead's near Big Bear in Southern California, and it's way up in the mountains. They still don't have a stoplight there, and it was these beautiful mountains. And I lived there for 12 years. Me and my buddy didn't know how to get by, and there was times at which we starved. And at one point, you know, I remember there was times when we went for 3 days without eating because we didn't have food. And I'll tell you something, you guys, you know, at that age you're bulletproof. I mean, I was skinny from not eating. But at one point, we lived in a house with a bunch of people who didn't have any money. And all they had for food there was a 50-pound sack of oatmeal, which looks like a 50-pound sack of dog food. And all we had was oatmeal and water for 2 weeks. And I got desperate. And I was riding an old Suzuki 250 two-stroker, I think, back then. And there was a construction boom going on. Desperation, right? I watch nowadays, I notice a lot of parents that I know, or people's parents, don't want their kids to have any hardships. But hardships is what really makes people change. You know, I don't change as much when life is easy as I do when things get tough and my back's against the wall. So I began to ride to the construction sites all over until somebody gave me a job. Every day I went out, and then I went around and I asked, and it was this big construction boom, and that's what was happening. And I ultimately got a job there was a little more to it, but I ended up with a job as a roofer, which I really liked. Now I'm like 17 years old, right? 16, 17 at this time. And climbing around, monkeying on the houses, I thought it was great, and I became really good really fast, and I ended up getting a little house. And back then, this was late 70s, probably. Yeah, I was 18. I was 18 in 1978. I was 17 in 1977. It's about when I started roofing, and I learned quickly. And the wages began to go up. I still remember my first $100 day, and I got my own truck. And back then, life was simple. We didn't have cell phones. Hell, we didn't even have answer machines. You had to have a secretary if you wanted to get your messages. But life was simple, and I got a little house I rented for $175. It was a small house, and I bought a bunch of equipment, and I got compressors and air guns, and I worked really hard for these things, and I became successful at this. And by the age of, I wasn't even 18, I remember going to work for the big company in town that was all legal, and being worried that they would find out I wasn't yet 18 of legal age to work, but they never asked. And so I got into this business, got my own house, and became a little house. And life was simple back then. I bought an old truck. He would buy it. Nobody took out a loan on cars, on a vehicle. Nobody I knew. I never saw that happen. I would buy old trucks for $500. Some of them had the chains on the gates. You see them in antique shows now, but back then they were common. And they were simple vehicles. So life was very simple and easy. And I would drive these old trucks until they had a real problem, and I'd buy another one. If you wanted a real nice vehicle, you would get one for $3,500. You know, you could spend the big money, but I never did. And I was happy with all that. So anyways, back to this story. I became really good at this roofing gig, and I had my little house, which was like a shoebox little thing. You know, it wasn't nothing fancy. And I was able to, you know, I had a home, and I was just a kid still, and it was exhilarating, you know. And back then, I'm just going to say this way it was before the that yuppies were invented. We didn't have that. That wasn't, it was okay to be a regular working guy back then. There wasn't this mad rush for materialism, at least I don't remember it. Most of my friends drove older trucks. We went to the deserts on the weekends to ride dirt bikes. We went to Deep Creek, which is a creek that, you know, all the kids would go to. We went to the hot springs. We spent a lot of time doing things together. We went to a lot of parties, and I have some good memories of that. But what eventually happened, you know, was I became too heavily involved in drugs, and I got in really bad shape. And 12 years later, I ended up moving from there down to San Diego, and I had to live with my father again. I was like 25, 26 years old by then, right? And my father had gotten busted, although my father never did have a problem with drugs or any of that stuff. I did, but he had gotten divorced, and he had his big change in his life. And so we rented this little house together. It was like a triplex or something. And I began to go back to work, and I cleaned up there. And I've, you know, been out of that scene since for a long time now. And so I went to work, and I decided that I would try the American dream. Now, sometimes you guys hear me say, I had a 3-bedroom house, 2 cars, and a truck, and a dog and some cats and a washing machine and cable TV, and which I did. But I didn't always have that. So I decided to try the American dream. And so I went to work. I already was a journeyman rooferman and very good at that job. And I ended up getting into a 3-bedroom house with 2 cars and a truck. They were older ones, like it wasn't, but I had them, and a dog and some cats and nice furniture and in San Diego and big yards and the whole American dream. This was my shot at it. And I did that for some time, but I'm going to tell you something. It really began to wear on me, because what I felt like was that what came with it was this little basket of bills that sat on the top of the refrigerator. And about every 15th of the month, I'd pull that little basket down, or sometime later in the month, and start going through it to find out what I could ride and what I had to pay. And it, you know, and I'll tell you what, it seemed like all I did was go to work to pay for this stuff. I went to work every day, I got my money, and I gave it to somebody else. And to me, it seemed like I was taking my money, because this was the American dream. You're supposed to do this to make you happy, right? To be a success. You're a success. And I would take my money, and then I began to see this vision of this little fat bald guy standing next to me smoking a cigar, right? And I'm working, and I'm giving him my money, and he's talking to me, and he's saying, "You're doing great, son. You're making it at the game of life. You are a success. We are all so proud of you." And he's going on and on. And I'm looking at him, and I'm all dirty from working, right? And I'm like, "Yeah, fat boy. Well, I'm working this weekend. What are you doing?" And he's like, "Well, I'm going on vacation to the Bahamas, but don't worry, because my secretary will still be here to take your check." This is the way I seen it. And I had this feeling like there was something more for me than supporting all this stuff. I had a lot of stuff by then. Man, it's easy to get in America, at least it has been. And I had to, and I through a few things that happened. One was I read a couple of books. Both were by Richard Bach. One was Jonathan Livingston Seagull, a very easy read, and the other one was Illusions, also written by Richard Bach. Very short, very books about freedom. And there was a couple things that happened. I met a guy who had done something similar and had escaped it. This guy, Donnie, and I still remember him. He was half Mexican, half Indian, and he looked like both. And he had gotten a job working in the nuclear power plants and made a lot of money. And he did the same thing. He bought a condo, and he had a nice car. And at one point, he told me, he said, "I came home and I laid on the bed and I quit." I said, "What do you mean you quit?" And he said, "I quit." I said, "How come?" He said, "It was killing me." He said, "Now I live cheap, and I don't have them fancy cars. I keep that truck out there with the camper shell on. It's got a bed." And he said, "I like to travel." He said, "You know, when I was in Colorado last year, and I met this girl, and I spent time living with her, and she lived way out in the mountains," he said, "and we were he said, I remember being in the creek and picking up pretty rocks and saving them in a bag." And I said, "Well, what were you saving pretty rocks in a bag for?" He says, "I don't know, man." He says, "That's just what we were doing." He said, "But I kind of think that's living too." And I'm going to tell you what, you guys. I looked around at that stuff, and this is just my experience. I'm not speaking for anybody else, but I looked around and I realized that everything there owned a piece of me, you know, and I spent my whole life trying to maintain the journey of my stuff, because it all needs maintenance whether you own it or not. But this had begun to turn around, and I would ultimately come to this idea that I don't exist to maintain the journey of my stuff. The stuff exists to maintain the journey of my spirit. And if it is not actively doing that, then I have no room for it in my life, because it is in the way of the journey of my spirit. That's the way I came to see things over time. So between Donnie and those 2 books and some other stuff that happened, you know, I felt like I didn't have a life, you guys. I felt like there was something more for me. This is my personal experience. This is what happened. And one day, I went out to my truck and I loaded my bike, my tools, and some clothes into it. And I drove away. And I left it there. People said to me, "Why didn't you sell all that stuff?" And I'm like, I needed that stuff gone now. I just left it. That stuff was killing me. I felt like it was taking the life I wanted from me, because I was spending all my time maintaining it. I talked to a friend who had some property, and he had a small trailer on it, and I decided to rent it from him. And I moved into this little trailer, which was almost unlivable, and it was very hard to get used to. I went from this big house with all these amenities and this nice furniture to this little teeny fucking trailer in a friend of mine's yard. And I remember thinking, what the hell have I done, you know? And the place was, I could live in it now, but the place was almost unlivable. And by a real fluke that I won't bother getting into, an old Airstream trailer fell in my lap. I bought this Airstream trailer for $1,100. I pulled it down there. I stuck it on my buddy's property. Now he charged me $150 a month to keep it there. And you know, I'm really grateful to my mother at this point, because she lived in trailers on people's property throughout different times through her life. And I'm really glad that I was shown in my youth that you didn't have to have all that stuff. I already knew this. I knew I could live without it. And not everybody has that opportunity. They grow up in big houses and think you have to have everything, and that you have to work real hard to get it all the time, and that's the end and aim of life. And maybe it is for them, but for me it was not. That was not. And so I stuck in this trailer, and $150 a month. I hooked it up. Everything where it was small. It was 30 years old, little Airstream trailer. But everything, it was 5 steps from the front of my couch to my bathroom sink. I got rid of absolutely everything I didn't use, man. I got rid of my big GMC truck. I bought a little mini Toyota truck they used to have. Everybody used to be driving them back then. I bought it used for $1,600 and change. It had like a broken window in it, and I fixed it. It was a long bed with a 5-speed, which worked for my business. I had extra steel welded into the bumper to haul a trailer when I needed to haul heavy stuff. And I got rid of absolutely everything. I had a shed I was able to keep my bike in. Of course, I rode a nice soft tail back then. In the trailer, I put in 2 knives, 2 forks, 2 spoons, 2 plates, 1 pan, and 2 pots, because it takes 2 pots to reheat cowboy coffee, and I wasn't going to get a coffee machine. So from that day forth, dishes could never pile high in the sink because there wasn't enough. If you had to clean out the trailer, which they get messy pretty quick, it was a 5 or 10 minute job. It took no time at all. I was really angry with stuff, in all honesty. I felt like stuff had taken my shot at the things I wanted to do from me. And I'll tell you a really strange thing that I really will never forget happening. Somehow in that truck, a box of pots and pans and cookware had made it with me to my trailer. And one day, I'm glad nobody was there, and I pulled up a trash can. All we had was a metal trash can. And I'm pulling out a piece of this. Some of it was nice cookware, some of it was old. And I'm pulling out like a pan, and I'm holding it up in the air, and I'm screaming, "Out of my life, you motherfucker, I'm never washing you again!" And I'm throwing this shit into the metal garbage can, and it's clang. I'm throwing it hard, and it's clanging. I was so angry about it by then. I was just pissed off at it, man. And all that stuff went out, and life became very easy. I experienced a freedom. I felt like the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders. It was so hard to let go of that stuff, but once it was gone, I wondered why I had waited so long, why I had lived in that big house so long. This was on Rocky's property. His house was in front of mine, and there was another guy who lived in a trailer out back, who he and I became very good friends. I lived there 5 years. I put carpet outside of my trailer, and I put 3 couches and a love seat in a circle with a table, and everybody would come hang out in my living room, my outside living room, and drink coffee. In the summer, I'd string a tarp to the house so that I had shade there, right? So I had like this outside. I owned a little roofing business by then. I just really mostly worked myself, which is really the best way to do that. And I was, all of a sudden, I was making too much money. And so I began to cut the workload back, man. I would have to lie to my customers. I would have to tell them that, you know, I was booked up, and I'm really good. So when you get a mechanic who can fix your car, you want him. When you get a roofer that takes really good care of your, you know what I mean? I would have to lie to him and tell him I was booked up for a month, but I wasn't booked up for a month, man. You know, you can't tell him, look, man, I'm not going to do your job because I'm going to go out, I'm busy going out to enjoy my life. It's easy to assume that I got out of the rat race by moving on to a motorcycle, but that would not be the truth at all. I got out of the rat race by getting rid of all my excess stuff and moving into that trailer. That gave me the freedom to find what my personal true calling was, what it was for me to really do, and then to pursue that. So hitting the road was not how I got out of the rat race. Hitting the road and finding a life out here was a byproduct of first getting out of the rat race. And I'm not knocking the rat race. I got plenty of friends who live in it, and it's a good life for them. But it did not work for me. So this just gave me a lot of time on my hands, and I began to do a lot of things. I tried a lot of different things. I became a beach bum for a while. That wasn't really where it was at for me. And I began to go to all kinds of events. I could go to events around the city, and I didn't have to worry about being home because I didn't have to be up early in the morning. So I could stay out, and I'm a young man still. Think about, you know, remember that. And I began to know people all over the city. I couldn't go anywhere without running into people I knew, and my life, my social life expanded dramatically. But ultimately, I began to hit on motorcycle trips, man. There was a couple, this guy Fitz and his old lady Vicky, and he had moved into a trailer park. He worked driving a truck all the time so that they could take these long motorcycle trips. They moved into this trailer park so that they were able to do this. And he rode a bagger, and I'm riding that Softail at the time, and Vicky had a Softail for a while, and then Fitz ended up getting her a bagger too. But so I began to go on long motorcycle trips. Fitz would call me because he knew I had time and I had money and I could go. And he would call me and invite me, and I started taking these trips with these guys, man, and my spirit just came alive on these rides. Just came alive, man, and in a way I had never experienced before. And after a while, Fitz and Vicky abruptly moved to Colorado, and they left me on my own. And after Fitz and Vicky left, I began to take a lot of short trips alone. And I would just ride over into Arizona. I'd find any excuse to go there, a hot springs, a camp out, a little motorcycle rally. And I'd take a week to 10 days, and I began to do this all the time, a lot. And one day I rode over the mountains into the desert from San Diego. And when I got into the desert, I was riding down the highway, and I just knew. I knew this is where I was supposed to be. I don't know how I knew, but I just felt it. I just knew it. And the trips got longer and longer. And my first month-long trip was in 1991. I went to Sturgis. And I rode up through Oregon. I got in a bike wreck and traveled anyway, kept going anyway, and I had this fantastic time. And again, my spirit came alive in a way I'd never experienced before. And when I got back, and from then on, I began to save money in the winter and travel in the summers and be gone all summer. And sometimes I'd run out of money and keep going anyway. That was very interesting the way that happened. But I really began to doubt my sanity. You know, because there was nobody else I knew at the time doing this, and I thought, are you crazy? So that was a problem for a while. But in those early years, I would go home in the winter, so I would get to go practice all summer and see what I could learn and see what I could get, and then go back to my trailer and take a break. Rocky had me on his property, not for money. In most towns, there's somebody somewhere who would like to have somebody on their property for reasons other than money. Maybe they're not there much, and they would like to have somebody watch the property because it's been broken into. Maybe they have animals and plants and would like to be able to get away and have somebody to watch the place while they're away. Or maybe, as in the case of Rocky, they just liked the social aspect of it, which was why he had done it. So when I began to be gone for months, I asked him, I said, hey man, how about I turn this trailer off and just pay a storage fee on it? And his offer was, sure, do that, $30 a month. I was like, okay. I was thinking more, right? But he didn't need the money. He didn't care. It was this ratty old piece of land with this ratty old house. And he worked for the school district. He was union. And he was just happy with a very simple life. He was a very simple man. And we were best friends for 5 years. The 5 years that I lived there, we spent a lot of time together. He weighed 350 pounds, this guy, right? And so this gave me the freedom. I began to follow my heart. They say, do what you truly love to do because you truly love to do it, and the money will come. And the things I needed began to come to me to make this happen. So I began to save money in the winters and then travel in the summer. And 1 year, this year was a real game changer for me. The spring came. It was actually wasn't even spring. I was going to Daytona, which starts in March. And I'd never been to Florida before in my adult life. And I had $500 only. But my heart was screaming at me. My insides were screaming at me to go. And now I'm not religious, but I do believe in a God. And most people do, I guess. And if you don't, it doesn't matter to me. I'm not trying to sell nothing here. But people talk of trusting God, but what we really trust is money. Because it is hard to trust something you can't hold in your hand. But this year it was going to be different. I was very much inspired by the book, The Peace Pilgrim, who you can look her up online. She walked for 27 years she didn't carry a jacket, she didn't carry a sleeping bag, she didn't have any money. She spoke on every radio station in the nation. People would fly her to Hawaii to speak at their college. She did this for 27 years, man. And you can find her on YouTube if you want and find out more about her, but I was inspired by her. So this year I only had $500, and I looked up before I left and I said, you know what, man? I didn't have enough money to get back. I said, you know what I have to do. I said, I'm going to leave on blind faith this year, and we're going to see if you can keep a man on a motorcycle going across this great country. And I took off freaking out, man, scared to death. And I went to Daytona in Florida, and I stayed in Florida, I think, for 2 months. And it's amazing on this whole trip is what I needed came to me. I'm not saying I didn't get low. I got down to $50 a few times. But what I needed came to me. And I looked for work and I found it. Sometimes it found me. And so I stayed in Florida 2 weeks, and I traveled up the coast. And by now I'd learned, at that time, I went to different motorcycle rallies. It gave me a place to go. And I began to learn about how to work at these rallies a little bit. I found out you could load trucks and stuff. That's another story. I really kind of learned this from Panhead Billy. But I traveled up into Canada, and I met a girl there, and I stayed with her for a month. And you know what's interesting? She was a waitress, and she had these jars of change in her bedroom. And I said to her, what do you do with the pennies? And she said, oh, I give those to kids. She says, back then you had to roll them to turn them in. She says, I don't bother with those. I said, well, why don't you let me have them? So she did. So I'm sitting out front of this bar, man, and it's a hot day, and I'm wearing shorts and engineer boots, so I kind of look like a freak, right? And there's this guy, only one guy there. It's in the middle of the day, and he's bugging me. And he's kind of irritating me. But as in conversation, he finds out I'm a roofer. He goes, dude, I need my house roofed. I'm like, you what? He said, well, you come look at it. I went and roofed his house, man. I'll tell you what, I'm not legal to work in Canada. It was Canadian money. So I didn't even know how to bid it, but I did. And I worked for some days on his house, and I made a chunk of change. And ultimately, I ended up leaving Wendy's place. She was later the first Easy Rider magazine story I ever wrote that was printed in Easy Rider was Wendy. And I ended up leaving there, and I went and some other places, and I ended up in Sturgis. Now I pull into Sturgis, I got $100 and a bald tire. I ain't got enough to make it back to San Diego, right? And I'm desperate, and I am running around trying to get a vendor job. By now I'm looking for work, and and nobody's hiring. One guy told me, he said, I've had 6 people look for work this year. We've got an influx of people wanting to work. I never seen anything like it, and I'm freaking out. And so I rode out to a park, and I had a little cigar, and I sat under this tree, and I looked up, and I said, you know my situation, man. It's up to you. If you want me to stay here, if I can't leave and I have to stay here for the winter, it's your fucking call, man. you know, I can't do nothing else with this problem. I've done everything I can. And so that night I'd been neglecting my friends because I'd been in Sturgis, you know, a few times by now. That night I went out dancing with friends. I got up late. I rode into town, and as I'm riding through town, there's this little fat guy pulls up next to me. Old, ugly, this guy. He never cuts the toenails on his Franken feet, and he's wearing flip-flops, man. And he looks over at me and he says, "Hey, Scotty." And I says, "Hey, Kenny, I knew this guy from Arizona, right? That's where he lives." And he says, "What are you doing?" I says, "Nothing." He says, "Do you want to go to the museum?" I says, "Kenny, I got a money problem. I can't be doing nothing like that." He says, "I'll buy." It was only $3, right? So we go to the museum, and and Kenny's been there before. I get caught up in the place, and Kenny splits. He says, "Look, come by my camp, man. Drink some coffee with me later if you want." And he splits. I walk out of that museum, and the rally's going on. And instead of going to my bike, I made a left, and I walked through some of the vendors, and I see this building off in the distance, and it's got all these motorcycles lined up going to it. And I walk over there. I'm like, "What's going on?" I look in there. It's a motorcycle tire changing operation. I'd never seen one before. And the boss comes up to me, and he says, "Can I help you?" And I says, "I don't know. I need a job, man." "You need a guy?" He goes, "You ever done this kind of work before?" I said, "No, but I'm a pretty good ranch. I've been working on stuff since I was a kid. My dad did, you know. He worked on the vehicles in the yard." And he looks at me for about a half a minute, and he says to me, "Pull the back wheel off that Softail right over there." And I had to get on the ground and use a lift, you know. And I got right down to my good clothes, and I went to work. And he showed me how to use the machines. And I didn't even ask how much I was getting paid. I was desperate. I'm figuring minimum wage. Guy walks off the street. I don't know. I can't say no. So I don't in this situation. So I don't even bother asking how much. And so I worked my ass off for half the week on this. So all the time I've been working there, I've been telling these guys, any good used tires comes in, let me know, guys. I need a tire. I need a rear tire, right? And none did. And at the end of the week, the bikes stopped coming, and we're just standing around. And Dick, his name's Dick, he owns that BMW shop still up there in Sturgis. And he says to me, "Now would be a good time to pull that garbage wagon you call a motorcycle in here and get all my shit back, you know, or whatever." Anyways, he says, "Now's a good time to bring your bike in here." So I bring my bike in, and Dick throws me a brand new tire. And I'm like, "What's this going to cost me?" And he says, "Just put it on, Scotty. You need it." And I'm like, he's right. So I just put it on the bike, and we did some other work to it. And when I got done, Dick handed me an envelope. And what I learned is that tire changing is one of the highest paying jobs in Sturgis. I didn't know that. So I had some money there, and then we tore down vendors. I had another friend, and we tore down vendors for a day or so, made another $100 or something. And eventually I left there, and eventually I got back to San Diego. Now, I left San Diego with $500. I traveled for 9 months, and I got back into San Diego with $550. Something changed in me that year. You know, and I began to, and I hated, by this time, I just hated being home. When I was there, all I wanted to do was leave again, get back to my life out here. And I began to look for ways to stay gone permanently. And I was hoping, I wasn't looking to ride an endurance ride of sleeping on picnic tables in a park. You know what I mean? Because you can do that for so long, but not forever. I was hoping to try to engineer a way that was comfortable enough to work as a long-term lifestyle. And I began to learn from anybody. I paid attention to any information I could get. I listened to every traveling salesman, every trucker, every hippie, every homeless person, any Boy Scout that I could talk to. There's stuff I use to this day that I learned from some of these, from homeless people. You know, that's really works well for me, and I began to put the pieces together. And even when I got back, even in the winter, I would still take short trips over to Arizona. I began to go down into Baja because it's cold. You know, I'm in San Diego. There's no place else to go. I would take short trips into Baja. And I began to get way better at this. And one of the things that traveling in the summers and coming home in the winters gave me was it gave me an opportunity to go out and learn stuff and practice my skills and then come back and relax. For me, that worked. And I was in the spring of 95, maybe. It was either 95 or 94 or 95. I think it was in the spring of 95, I think, that I took off to see if I could stay gone for a year. And I did. And I went back to San Diego, and I liquidated everything I owned except what fit on the motorcycle. And then I headed north for Oregon, and I've been on the road ever since, full time. I think that it was by the end of the second year of my being full time on the road that I began to hit the real problems. Guys call me sometimes, want to live on their bikes, and I always tell them, man, it's going to be great for a while, but there comes a point when you hit these real problems that will send a person home screaming. And some of the guys who hit the road will call me when they get into that, and most guys quit at that point, and I don't blame them. But those of us who keep going through it and figure out ways to get around these problems, once you get to the other side of that and you figured out your method, then the guys I've seen never go home. They never stop. They keep going. Life becomes real easy. That's when it gets easy. And so I've been on the road now for 25 years, and it's become a very easy life, and it's changed. I've become mellower. I'm 61 now, and I'm looking to live an easy life. And once in a while, somebody asks me if I want to settle down, and I'm like, I've tried it a couple times over the years, but I have a couple problems with it. One is I get bored. I want to go do something else. I get bored. And the other thing is it's a very hard life, comparatively speaking. Very hard. And so I really love this life, and it would have been so sad had I stayed in that little world of roofing just because it was secure and that I had never followed my heart or my calling. It would have been so sad. And I'm so glad that I was afforded the opportunity in this life to get out and follow the call of my spirit and follow it into something I never believed I could be. You know what I mean? And it's different for each person, but this is where mine's taken me. And so I took a chance, rolled the dice, trusted God, and followed my heart, and it brought me to this. And it's the best life I've ever known. That's why I keep doing it. Some have asked me to tell this story, and that's my shot at it. So I appreciate you for listening if you got this far.